Hello Steelers, and welcome to this video about wargaming and the First World War. It's actually a video that I've been wanting to make for quite some time now, and I just really haven't had the chance, so I thought, well, I'll just sit down and make a video about it. It's a subject that is very close to my heart, simply because I'm particularly interested in the First World War. I've got a real passion for it. Some of you probably already know that from some of the videos that I've put out over the length of this channel. There's a lot of battle reports about the First World War, about games about the First World War. I've done history videos about the First World War. I am generally to be found reading a First World War book. My education is in the First World War, so you know I'm pretty steeped in the First World War at this point. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert by far. You know, you can spend your entire life studying the First World War and not even scratch half the surface of the conflict itself, or even understand it. And you know that goes for all the different theatres across there. So I'm not putting myself across here as an expert, but I do have a particular passion for wargaming the First World War, and also just for really introducing people to how you can wargame the First World War. And from my point of view, the First World War has been absolutely criminally overlooked by wargamers. It's even going back as far as when wargaming started, it's very scant attention has been put on the war itself. I mean, I was looking at, I think it's a Donald Featherstone book from the probably early 80s, late 70s, and every aspect of warfare is covered in it. You know, each chapter, First World War's chapter is something like 4 pages, when all the rest are like, you know, 30, 40 pages. It's kind of that kind of thing, and I think this is an attitude that kind of sticks around. I think it was about last year sometime, there was a podcast put out where some guys were talking about the First World War and wargaming and how you really can't do it apart from certain bits and pieces. And I kind of want to address that as much in this particular video, and also just to give you some ideas as well, a little bit about the war, and you know where you can wargame it and how you can wargame it. And this is something I'm kind of trying to push a little bit, as I say, on the channel. Not, you know, I don't want to push it in people's faces because not everybody's interested in it, but I do keep putting out battle reports every so often. I mean, the thing is, there are quite a lot of First World War rules out there. There's also been relatively recently quite a number of rules released straight away. You know, but a lot of these kind of fallen into the weird war category of the First World War. It's now that, you know, if that's your thing, then that is great. To me, I have absolutely zero interest in that. Personally, I think the actual historical war itself is far more interesting than anything you could add to it. But if it's getting people interested in the First World War, then that's great. However, one or two of those rules, and I have read most of them that have come out recently, at least, you know, in some form of depth, just because I'm interested in seeing how people represent the war. A lot of them just kind of fall short, very much so, from my understanding of the war. And this is the thing, I think this is the problem again with a lot of the rules out there. There are some rules out there that I really like. I'm not going to talk about them here. I'm not going to name individual rules. If you're watching over this channel, you could probably work it out, to be perfectly honest. I don't need to tell you which my favourite sets of rules are. But a lot of them kind of really deal with small trench raids, you know, with only a handful of figures, or really large battle level kind of things, so divisional attacks and that kind of stuff. And there's this real gap in the middle of various rules as well that just don't seem to fit in that within that area. And it's something that always strikes me as quite interesting, that this is the point at where the war is fought, you know, right down at platoon level. I'll talk about it later in a bit more depth, but it's really missing out. You know, you are really abstracting a lot of the interesting stuff, in my opinion, in the war by just going to these massive divisional level games. I mean, they're great, and don't get me wrong, I do like big games, and I do like you know, the spectacular of those things. But what I mean is, there is a real gap in between where you can look at tactical levels of the First World War that really mean something, and will bring you a very interesting game on the tabletop. And you know, I'm talking there particularly about platoon level. That's the part of the war that I'm particularly interested in, is those platoon level actions and how those stuff develops. I mean, aerial warfare is pretty well covered for the First World War. There are so many war game rules out there. I mean, I've been playing them, you know, for 30 odd years. And there's also quite a few board games as well, which are aerial. So there's Wings of War, which is a pretty big game, First World War version of that. I quite enjoyed it for a long time. Not so much into it these days, but I think, you know, it's a great introduction to the aerial war. Naval warfare is also pretty relatively well covered, I would have said. That is, in a way, probably easier to deal with than doing the ground war, the First World War. So I think a lot of people have gone that way. I mean, to be fair, naval wargaming is not really something that I know a huge amount about, so, you know, I couldn't say either way, but I think, you know, there are quite a few naval war games out there that deal with the First World War. But there's not that many that really concentrate on the Western Front. And I'm not entirely sure why, because that is the theatre where the war was won. This, you know, arguably that is where the main thrust of the action was, and it's where the German army was defeated in 1918. This, you know, these are facts. This is where it happened. All the other stuff that happened around it, some of it helped that theatre, of course it did. However, all of it was basically supporting acts to where that war was won, and that was on the Western Front. It's not a war of manoeuvre. This is probably one of the big stumbling blocks that a lot of people get, or at least, you know, for the middle part of the war on the Western Front. I'm going to talk most about the Western Front because to me that is the most interesting part. It's not a war of manoeuvre in the classical sense, in that, you know, you've got Napoleon's army sweeping into northern Italy, for example. There are trench lines and there are trench blocks and there are, you know, these stop lines that are created within this, you know, gap of the trench lines. However, there is plenty of manoeuvre within those trench lines as well, within small attacks, within large attacks as well, you know, large operations. And trench lines do move. They're not set in stone in 1914 and then end in 1918. They do move within those years and move quite a lot as well, you know, from both attacks from the Allies and also counter-attacks from the Germans as well. You kind of have to see the First World War really as one large operation on the Western Front itself. So it kind of starts in 1914 with that the period of movements ending with the trenches, but then you get this period of attrition. So that goes on for the next three and a half years until 1918, when the German army has been ground down to such a point that they are basically broken through. Their manpower levels are so low that they are defeated in the field. And this is what happens on November the 11th, 1918. So when the armistice is signed, the German army is defeated. They know they are defeated. They can't fight anymore. They try to sign an armistice to basically allow them to fall back and restore a bit of peace, but it is over for them. And this is, you know, you have this period of attrition in between these years of 1914 to 1918. And in that, there is a massive learning curve as well that comes across on all sides, Allies and the Germans, which basically, you know, sees them developing new weapons, new tanks, and not tanks, but you know, tanks are developed, but also tactics as well, and that kind of thing throughout the war. And it's almost like an arms race. One side develops tactics on one side, the other side assault tactics, the other side develops defensive tactics, and they just, you know, they'll build up against one another. So to give you a brief outline of the war and to show you how different it is, again, I mean, you know, when people say, oh, it's the First World War, it's X, Y, Z, it's quite a black and white idea of it. I mean, the war starts in August of 1914, so it is actually, well, a little earlier than that, but it's almost halfway through the year at that point. So the Germans are seeing this as a quick war to finish France and just basically then turn on Russia. Doesn't happen, they get stopped at the Marne, and then that's when we get the trenches coming in. So really, for those first couple of months, it is that manoeuvre warfare that, you know, is the classic early war stuff that a lot of people do play in wargaming. And then it ends up with the trenches, the Germans falling back to previously sighted areas where they dig in on good terrain, and then the Allied armies kind of move up and then stop at these German stop lines. They can't move any further forward for various reasons, one mainly being artillery is just not good enough at that point to break through the German lines. Also, the troop tactics as well are still in their infancy for what we're going to see later on. By 1915, We're starting to get the large-scale battles. I mean, yeah, well, large-scale battles happened in 1914 with the French on the Marne, for example. They lose over 1 million casualties in the first few weeks of the war, for example. 1915, the British and the French in particular are trying to attack the Germans and get them out, because at this point the Germans have captured large parts of Belgium. They've also captured large parts of France as well. So this is an aggressive force sitting on captured territory. So they need to be kicked off it, which is, you know, the whole reason why the Germans aren't brought to the negotiating table until they are defeated in the field anyway. But basically we have large attacks in the Champagne Champagne area by the French. We also have British attacks at Loos and Aubers Ridge. There's also German attacks as well, small scale attacks, you know, to push the various areas around Ypres and places like that, some of the trenches around trying to capture the town, for example. Some of these are successes, some of these are failures, but it's still very much the beginning of the learning curve of all the armies are starting to develop, the season become proper modern armies compared to the armies that they were prior to that. And you know, they have to go through these stages to be able to get to 1918 basically. I mean, it's easy with hindsight to look back and say, well, you know, you could have done this better and this better, but at the time they only had the equipment that they had, the material that they had. This is also the time where, you know, the factories are only just starting to really rev up their output. So you get the shell scandal, for example, in 1915, when there just aren't enough shells in Britain. It causes the government to fall, and this is when Lloyd George takes over. And you know, you get these kind of issues that are all happening. This is like a real melting pot of issues in 1915, just the things starting to really kick off. By 1916, things have changed quite a lot. The men who did originally sign up, in Britain at least, to join the army from September, really from 1914 onwards, these men are now being trained. They are now pushed forward into the Somme, the Battle of the Somme. This was meant to be a dual French and British attack. Unfortunately, because of the German attack of Verdun earlier in the year, the French had to kind of pull out a lot of their line and go and defend Verdun. So therefore, the British army then kind of takes precedence when it comes to the Somme attack. And we have the first day of the Somme. From a British Army point of view, this is called the Black Day of the Somme. 58,000 casualties, of which 19,000 are killed, the rest are wounded. This is an aberration. It does not happen again. It does not happen again throughout the entire war, and it's certainly, you know, the British Army learn from their mistake, and it is a mistake. However, there are various areas where it went right in the down the right flank of the British Army, down around Mamet and Montauban and places like that. That's where the real pressure was applied after the first day of the Somme. And then throughout that Somme campaign, you also get various other things happening as well, where there are successes, there are local successes, and the British Army do manage to push the Germans quite far back up the Albert-Bapaume road. And they are also starting to introduce what I've already mentioned. The tank, for example, is introduced in September of 1916. It's rushed into action. Again, a lot of people blame the generals for being mechanically unminded, but Haig himself actually pushed for the tanks to be in. To blame him here is probably to say that he actually pushed them in too early. They just weren't ready. They didn't have any tactical nous at this point, and they really, you know, they suffered from it. But they were a great impact immediately. You've also got the development of infantry tactics as well, and this comes in from things like grenades, so the Mills bomb, for example, in the British Army, the stick grenade, the German Army. You're also getting things like the tin helmets from all the armies. They're starting to be used more and more in 1916. This real development from a professional army prior to this, or also a conscript army of the other armies, into more professionalism within the armies across the entire nations that are fighting. And then this also leads, because you've got these new weapons, so we've got, for example, rifles, rifle grenades, grenades themselves, and also the light machine gun as well, introduced in 1915. What that does is, the Lewis gun in particular, it takes away the Vickers, the heavy Vickers machine guns away from battalion, and puts those together into a corps, and meanwhile the Lewis guns what they have are then distributed down to platoon level. So it's giving firepower to the smaller units. The Germans do something similar with their MG 0815. That's a big Maxim gun that they basically turn into a smaller light machine gun, being the inoperative word because it's not particularly light. But then the French developed their platoon tactics as well. They developed their platoons from riflemen into these various different groupings of LMGs, rifle grenades, grenadiers, and also riflemen. The British follow suit, but then the British also write it down in SS-143, which is my favourite training pamphlet. The Germans do something slightly similar, but they're doing things with the Stoßtruppen, the stormtroopers, as they're also known, and they are kind of developing new tactics with them as well. But they are kind of weakening their army largely by drawing off the best men into these units. So this is 1916. It's a real, again, this learning curve, and it's not exactly a flat curve. It is a bit of a up and down kind of curve. And as I say, it's this idea that you have these two competing powers fighting against each other in war terms as well. So it's an arms race. So you've got as good tactics are developed on one side, good defensive tactics, and it just keeps climbing like that. By 1917, the French army is in bits after the large naval offensives early in April, which kind of means also the British are attacking at Arras as well around there. But it also means then that the British army kind of had to take up the mantle really, and they really have to push. They are now leading the Allied fight on the Western Front for the rest of the war, at least until August of the next year. And there are huge, again, successes throughout 1917. So we've got Messines Ridge, for example, where they basically take the top off with mines, and then they are attacked and captured very quickly. This is Plumer leads this. Then we have Battle of Cambrai as well, where again a huge amount of tanks are used there in the attack there. And this again is interesting from a mythological point of view, because the reason that Cambrai was chosen as an attack ground was because the ground itself wasn't particularly broken up like other areas, and it was good going for tanks, so that's pretty much why they chose it. But you've also got as well, we've mentioned aberrations before. Another one is the Third Battle of Ypres, or Passchendaele, as most people will probably know it. This happens throughout summer and into autumn of 1917, and that is an absolute mudbath. Now, the amount of mud on photos that you see are generally taken from this, and that's largely because there were a lot of photographers. Well, the photographers that were working, the official military photographers, were working largely during Passchendaele. So a lot of the photos you see repeated in books and things, the stretcher bearers carrying, trying to climb through mud, and horses being pulled out of mud baths and things. A lot of those are from that particular battle, so they're not the same as a year previously, or even in other areas like Cambrai, as I've mentioned. But we also get in 1917, for me personally, I think it's the most interesting aspect of the war, the most interesting year of the war, because this is a real development of where things start to come to fruition. I've already mentioned it, infantry tactics really come to the fore. They are completely different to what they were a year ago. They are more like modern day infantry tactics, and if you were to show modern day soldiers, and I've done this, the training pamphlets at the time, they would recognise the fire and manoeuvre elements within those platoons. You've also got as well artillery. I mean, the tank is probably the big thing that a lot of people know about as a technological advance in the First World War, and rightly so as well. I mean, it is, it's a major step forward. It's not a war-winning weapon. It still breaks down even in 1918. Its range of combat is about 20 miles tops. Most tanks that jump off, I think there's 350 or so that jump off on the first day of Cambrai. By the second day, over 50% have broken down or been destroyed. So they really do suffer from the law of diminishing returns. Artillery, on the other hand, is the war winner, and it causes the most casualties throughout the war. And in 1917, you really start to get the scientific artillery developments that really bring it to the fore as well. I mean, it's been used previously as a destructive weapon. So on the Somme, for example, they fire a week's worth of bombardments on the German trenches to try to destroy the trenches, but they also start experimenting with what are called rolling barrages, which are barrages that just move forward with the men moving behind it, so protecting the men whilst keeping the heads down of the enemy, and it works particularly well as well. But they also develop things like hurricane bombardments, where they are able to just drop artillery very quickly and without any ranging or any ranging needed. They also develop flash spotting, sound ranging, also aerial identification with wirelesses working with the aircraft as well. So artillery, it gets to a point where it is, I think again, it's good to talk about Cambrai for example. The German batteries had counter battery fire put on them basically with no warning whatsoever, and I think something like 90% of them on the first day were put out of action, so the Germans just could not call on their artillery to come back and help with the defence as the British attacked. So you've got these again massive scientific developments within artillery. I mean, I'm not going to talk about them too much because that would be a video in itself, but to give you a quick idea, flash spotting is where they are looking for the muzzle flashes of the enemy artillery and able to plot it on maps. And sound ranging is something similar, but instead they're using the sound of the German guns, or the enemy guns should I say, and then triangulating it basically to where it would be on the point. And these are very, very accurate techniques for tracking and plotting exactly where the enemy are, and knowing, and basically just keeping it quiet until it's time to attack, and then you just hit them with everything you've got. By 1918, things are massively different. So we got the large German Kaiserschlacht offensives. This is in the early part of the year, the spring offensives. It's a series of offensives. But it is really the last desperate roll of the dice for the German high command at this point. America is just about to start landing millions of men on. They've already joined the war in 17. They don't really have a huge presence on the Western Front until later in the year, and it's only the men are starting to come across. The Germans know this. They know that time is running out, that they will be able to hold the Allied armies. So they try to attack against Amiens. It is a tactical success. It pushes through the area where the British and the French armies meet, so it's just their middle point, pushes right through, scatters the armies in front of them and pushes all the way up to the edge of Amiens, but no further than that. It's a tactical success, but it is actually a strategical failure. That's because it very quickly runs out of steam. It has no particular direction after the first attack. It's just kind of piecemeal attacks left, right and centre wherever they can or wherever they think they can. And all it does, it just serves to grind up the German army as much as anything else really. It's really just really wrecks their army and completely tires them out. They're already, as I say, on their knees anyway at this point, but they are, after the German spring offensives. They're still capable, but they are, pretty much spent at this point as an army. And the Allied counter-offensive Amiens, Battle of Amiens, 1918, August, the Black Day of the German Army is called, August 5th, absolutely just sweeps straight through the Germans, takes back everything that they already took. It's about 50 miles worth of terrain, takes it back and then some, and then manages to get through the Hindenburg line almost pretty easily in the later part of that campaign, so November, as the war is kind of, and once the Hindenburg line is shattered, the German gun line is open and the defences are just gone. This is really where the Germans then have to sign their armistice, simply because they are beaten in the field. And that ends the war. That is a potted history of the war, some of the larger operations going on. But I already mentioned, we've got all these technological advances within the war, but one of the major things, I've kind of mentioned it a little bit, as the war progresses, the command structures actually drop right down the level. They come right down to platoon level. Junior officers are now taking over and are the lieutenants, for example. These are the people who are thinking about decisions, making decisions on the battlefield. They are the ones that are pushing the operations forward at those kind of levels. So this is perfect for small scale gaming. So a platoon is about 40 men, depends on the army, but let's say between 40 and 50 figures. And it's a really nice way of just representing those small scale things that a lot of people don't seem to do so much. As I said, I've already mentioned it, a lot of the First World War games are pretty low level kind of things. They're either very small trench raids. And remember that trench raids aren't just a few men sometimes getting prisoners. They can be going up to battalion level, or even a couple of battalion levels. So we're talking 800,000 men involved with artillery support and all the other support you would expect from a major operation. But they're still called trench raids. You know, a trench raid just doesn't have to be 5 men messing about in a trench. I see a lot of games that think that way. The First World War as well, I mean, it's not just this myth of men just walking into machine guns. I mean, hopefully, I've kind of covered this a little bit with platoons. I mean, it's an incredibly rare occurrence. It did happen, of course, but it is an incredibly rare occurrence, and attacks I've already mentioned were generally preceded by some kind of artillery barrage, or at least support. Some of that would be destructive early in the war. By the later war, you've got these different types of fire plans. So you've got the rolling barrage, which moves forward as the men move forward. You've got hurricane bombardments, where they are just battering an area very quickly, and then the attack goes in very quickly. And the men are not just walking; they're running as well. Even during the first day of the Somme, the Irish 36th Division climbed out of their trenches and they ran at the German lines. They even got there before the British artillery had lifted its bombardment, and some of the men were caught up in it. So this is even on the Somme, they're not. And there's also video footage of men at Hawthorne Crater running across the ground as well. So you can see them actually, doing these things. They're not just walking. So that is a myth, straight up there. I'm going to kill that dead. And this tactical development, you really kind of, it's a huge scope for players to just try to understand various problems that face the commanders on the ground. How do you deal with a German strong point? You don't just charge at it. You have to work around the flanks. You have to put down a covering fire, get around the flanks, and then get in the back. And these are things that you can explore on the Wargaming table quite easily. And with great fun as well. Again, I hope some of my videos have shown how to do this. The difference in the weapons gives you a massive range of options that you can play about with. So you've got rifles, grenades, rifle grenades, light machine guns, tanks, aircraft, artillery, you name it. You can use all these bits and pieces, to throw at the enemy. You've even got light artillery that you can use on the table as well, if you're down at platoon level. All the armies were using all these different things, all these different weapons, and they're all interesting in themselves. It's as complex and as wide-reaching as the weapons in the Second World War. In some cases, probably more so, because they are actually trying to experiment as much as possible with breaking that trench line. And also, you've got the idea of using tanks. The difficulties of using tanks, crossing bad terrain in really horrible conditions within the tanks themselves. Just the idea that you've got to get this metal box with 8 men getting carbon dioxide poisoning across the battlefield, and then fight, and also take small arms fire and things. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do if you're big interested in the tank side of things. Then that is something you can certainly look into. And I've already mentioned it. It's not just a sea of mud. I mean, the photographs from the Battle of Third Ypres kind of create this myth, really. But the first day of the Somme, for example, is fought in the middle of summer. It's fought on a bright sunny day. It's fought in waist-high grass, because the grass has been growing for the last 2 years in between no man's land. In fact, some of the units actually laid down in the grass to hide from it while the British bombardment went off, for example. So, it's completely different to what you would expect. You could quite easily just set up a grass mat with a few shell craters across it, and there you go, you've got yourself a first day of the Somme battlefield almost. Much of the fighting in 1918, the War of Movement, is very much like the fighting in 1940 in France. They're fighting through villages and towns that just haven't been touched by the war, because they're so far behind the actual destructive zone of the artillery. So again, you could use pretty much any of your buildings that you already have for the Second World War, get those on the table, and just create a small village and have a fight through that. With some First World War stuff. Easily done. You don't always have to have trenches. I mean, this is excuse me. This is probably one of the big things with Wargamers is the bespoke trench boards that you see, which are beautiful, but you don't really need them because they're not always fighting in trenches. 1917, for example, the German defensive doctrine is to use shell craters rather than trench lines because they're less obvious. Also strong points such as the mebus, the concrete bunkers, for example. So you could quite easily make those out of just some scraps, bits and pieces here and there. There's plenty of companies that sell shell craters, plenty of companies that sell bunkers as well. So you can grab those and just stick those on a table, get a brown cloth, and there you go. You've got third Ypres. You know, you can do that if you want quite easily. So, you know, there's also actually a lot of companies that sell trench systems as well. I think one of the best ones out there is Early War Miniatures, but there's plenty of others. I think Brigade Models do a trench system as well, and there's various other ones that you can get from various places. There'll be ones you can 3D print if you're that way inclined. There's so much you can do. You know, you don't have to have those bespoke trench boards. I don't have them, and I've never suffered from playing trench system games in any of my games at all. Right, well, I mean, I'm kind of going to wrap up there because I could go on for a long time about this, because as I say, it's a subject that I really, really like and I'm really interested in. I think there's a lot more. If there's more stuff you want to know about, I mean, ask in the comments, of course. I've obviously been a lot more talking much more about the Western Front because to me that's the most important and interesting part of the war. There are obviously so many other theatres. It's a world war after all. I mean, you could fight in Italy. There's not many people using the Italian campaign for their wargaming. There's the Middle East campaigns against the Ottomans. Even out in the Far East, Japanese versus Germans out in Tsingtao, places like that. That'll be interesting to get on the table. But what I'll do is I'll put some basic book recommendations in the description down below as well, so you can check those out. And some of these, you know, some of them are just going to be some good introductory background reading to the First World War. You know, stuff, myth-busting stuff. You know, things that you think you know about it will blow it out of the water. And also I'll put in a couple of books as well that will probably give you a good idea, some ideas for at least for scenarios of you know, looking at the First World War in different lights and from a wargaming point of view. I mean, I'll wrap it up there, and I'll just say thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, do hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment down below, of course, and please get out there and do some First World War wargaming.